as many may know, the competent authorities in Ireland are mandated to accept anonymous reports, and for internal reporting, employers are free to decide whether to accept them, and there is no obligation to follow up. However, as we have been hearing throughout the conference, through our experts talking about best practice, there is real value to facilitating anonymous reports. And of course, the EU directive does require that where an anonymous reporter is later identified, they be afforded the same protection as a named whistleblower. And of course, the Global Leaks tool is aimed at overcoming some of the challenges in that regard. So we've looked at some of the tools and guidance developed for organisations to facilitate whistleblowing in line with best practice. However, even where there are good systems, speaking up can be very challenging, and good quality advice and guidance for individuals to help them protect themselves, of course, is essential. Support measures and advice are indeed a cornerstone of the EU directive, although sadly it is one of the most under-implemented provisions across the 27 EU member states. So Jennifer, you have a lot of experience supporting and advising whistleblowers. Please, could you tell us about your organisation, the Signals Network, and the development of the new guides for whistleblowers, which you've overseen? Thank you.
Thank you, Ida, for having us. So I'm the legal director, as Ida said, of the Signals Network. The Signals Network is an international nonprofit that works to provide all-encompassing support for whistleblowers. So we get whistleblowers coming to us when they've seen something wrong and they just want advice on what their options are. We get whistleblowers coming to us who are partway through the disclosure process, either with their employer or in certain cases with journalists. And we get people who have already spoken to journalists. And by that point, you can imagine something's gone horribly wrong because the employee has felt that they've had no option but to start speaking externally about what they've seen or heard. So we provide everything from legal support to, we have a fund that can provide them with psychosocial support. Whistleblowing is quite a traumatic experience, to digital and physical security where needed. And we also work quite often with journalists to try to get them to better protect their sources, to understand what a whistleblower is going through, to understand what that journey is like, and to understand the type of support that type of source in particular needs. And one of the things we've done in terms of trying to give employees and workers guidance is create a series of handbooks. So about 3 years ago now, 2 years ago, we partnered with Afoma Azoma, who was a whistleblower from Pinterest, who raised the alarm about racial discrimination inside the company. And Afoma has set out to, in the US, try to reform whistleblowing protection laws so that disclosing things like racial discrimination are protected now in California. And one of the other things she did was create what was called the Tech Worker Handbook. We, along with several other partners, wrote various chapters for it, trying to give workers guidance, because what she noticed is, in particular in the tech industry, there was a significant lack of regulation and protections for workers in that industry, and simple guidance on what are your options. When she blew the whistle, she didn't know where to start. She didn't know how to raise the concerns. And the Tech Worker Handbook comes from that perspective, which is giving employees as much information as possible so they can make the most informed decisions about how to raise the concerns they have. And so after the success of that in the US, we worked with partners like Whistleblowing International Network, Dr. Lauren Kieran's here in Ireland, and also Protect in the UK to produce UK and Irish versions of that handbook. And those handbooks set out both the legal frameworks in the country for protection. So we've talked a lot about anonymous versus named, right? But knowing that if you submit anonymously, your employer doesn't necessarily have to deal with your concerns is really important for workers to understand when deciding how to raise those concerns, because the implication of not understanding that is they very well might get upset when they submit anonymously and then don't feel like they've had a response. The kind of common theme amongst everyone I speak to on a daily basis is they've gotten to me because they didn't feel like they were being heard internally. They don't start with me, they wind up with me at the end of a journey. And so what the handbooks aim to do is kind of say, this isn't legal advice. Here's the legal frameworks you need to understand. Here's some key terminology. What does it mean to report anonymously? What does it mean to give your name? Are you protected? Confidentiality versus anonymity, things like that. But also, here's some practical advice. Whistleblowing is fundamentally a hard thing to do. It is not something people choose to do. Every single person I've spoken to has felt they've had no other choice. They felt compelled in some way to speak out. And so what we put in the handbook are kind of a series of practical tips, things to think about, things to be aware of, a personal assessment that asks questions like, what are you hoping to achieve by blowing the whistle? Are you going to be okay if you blow the whistle and nothing happens, right? Are you financially going to be okay? Here are some questions about employment. What are you planning to do after you blow the whistle? What about legal? Have you sought legal advice? And I know that can be quite a scary thing for an employer, but sometimes the lawyer is your best friend as an employer, because the lawyer will say to the whistleblower, there's not a claim here. Or there might be a claim, but be aware of the challenges you're facing. It also talks about retaliation and asks them in the personal assessment a series of questions about the work environment to make sure they actually have tried to speak out in the work environment first, that they've tried those channels. It provides a budget template so they can really think through what are the financial implications going to be. Whistleblowing is an expensive option. Again, I feel like I repeat this a lot, but it is not something someone chooses to do. It is not a financially lucrative decision to make. And with every whistleblower, one of the first questions I ask them when I'm talking to them is, what are you going to do for a job? What's the plan for a job? Because by the time they've gotten to me, often the concerns are quite serious, and the implications of blowing the whistle they may not be able to go back to that career because of the response they will get. It's also about building a team, and our name, the Signals Network, kind of says it all. We aim to build a network around the whistleblower so they have the protection and the support they need. And that support isn't just, legal advice. It is psychosocial support. It is a community around them. It is family. It is friends. It is other whistleblowers. It's understanding they won't be alone on the journey. And so for us, it really is about making sure the employees, you start a job and you get a company handbook. And the handbook sets out a lot of things, but the one thing the handbook rarely sets out is, how do you blow the whistle? If you see something wrong, how do you blow the whistle? And how do you do so in the most constructive way that achieves your objective? Because the one thing every whistleblower wants is they want to see the concern they have addressed in some manner. And so that's kind of where it was coming from. It's worth saying the tech worker handbooks that are now a series, they're not, well, we've aimed them at tech workers because that industry in particular has seen increasing numbers of workers coming out and speaking, because regulators haven't quite gotten a handle on it because they don't know who to go to. Often they're not even sure which regulator they're supposed to be talking to with their concerns. The handbooks themselves are largely applicable to any industry, and we don't have a specific, we get people from everywhere. So I will often refer them to elements of it, especially like the personal assessment or the budget or building a team, so they can start to understand what this is going to look like and what the journey is going to look like. And so they step into that environment with a plan and at least a little bit of understanding of what they're getting themselves into. And I think the last point I would say is the Tech Worker Handbook also talks about working with journalists, because especially in tech, we've seen an increasing number of workers talking to journalists, not understanding the risks that they're putting themselves under. And also talking to journalists because, again, they don't know who to go to, and they don't feel like their concerns are being addressed internally. And so it is helping them understand what their risks are, and what they need to consider if they're going that route, and how they might be protected under the new frameworks in Ireland.
There will sometimes be cases where the nature of the facts really mean that a whistleblower cannot remain anonymous. And of course, that's where, as it said, the facts are the signature of the case. And that's where perhaps we need to signpost towards support. Jennifer, you've worked very closely with some whistleblowers in recent times. Could you tell us a bit, or remind us, what whistleblowers really need where they can't protect their identity? And what sort of support services are helpful and employers and institutions could consider putting in place?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Ida said, we often wind up working directly with those who are most at risk, which are individuals who, for a variety of reasons, haven't been able to get to be heard through the various channels, and therefore feel they've been left with no choice but to go public. One of those individuals you're actually going to hear from tomorrow night, Mark McGann, the Uber Files whistleblower. We've been supporting since he went public last July, with The Guardian and a consortium of international journalists, the consortium of international investigative journalists. So one of the things I think it's most important to remember actually comes from a story Mark tells, about how, what's often not talked about with Mark's story is that he reached out multiple times to regulators in the year to 2 years before he wound up working with The Guardian, and couldn't get anyone to listen to him. But what ultimately made him share information with The Guardian was that the first time he was introduced to them by a friend, the journalist spent 45 minutes asking him about himself and how he was doing and how he was emotionally, and how difficult a decision it must be, and not the information. And he talks about how it was the first encounter he'd had where someone had treated him as a human and just treated him as someone they cared about. And I think it's a good lesson across the board, whether it's internal inside a company or outside with a regulator or with a journalist looking to work with a whistleblower, is at the heart of this is a human. And it's an individual who is struggling immensely, and often showing signs of trauma by what they've been through, what they've witnessed, what they've seen, the internal struggle themselves that they've had with themselves about what to do. And often just treating them as a human goes a long way. And it's, I often think with many of the people who come to us, and the vast majority of the people I work with are anonymous. They choose to stay anonymous because of the risks to themselves, their career, and yet they can't live with themselves if they don't tell someone, if they don't do something. In those cases, I often think if someone internally had just listened to them, they may not have wound up on my desk. So I think first and foremost, what whistleblowers need is someone to listen. I think second, it's worth remembering that every single one of the whistleblowers who winds up going external, whether to a regulator or a journalist or in some other way external, tried internally first. It's a complete myth that they didn't try internally. Every single one of them, bar none, have tried internally to raise those concerns, and had they felt heard, would not have taken the steps they've taken. And that's because nobody wants to go down this route. This is not I said it before, I'll say it again, not a lucrative route. It's not one that's going to help your career. It is a very, very difficult journey in which the journey itself, if the person isn't already experiencing trauma from the kind of struggle of the need to disclose and what they've seen or witnessed, the journey itself can be quite traumatizing for a whistleblower. Trying to navigate how how to disclose, trying to get someone to listen, not feeling like you're being listened to. And then once you do, for those who go public, overnight, you lose friends, colleagues, you know, people you wouldn't expect will suddenly become scared to talk to you, or not sure if they can talk to you, in part because they're then fearful it'll have an impact on their career, right? And with all of us, because we work, you know, we all in these jobs are working long hours. Your colleagues are also often your friends, so you can in some ways lose immediately the community you felt connected to. The other thing the whistleblowers often need is advice, understanding what's going to happen, right? What's going to happen if you go public versus if you don't go public? What's the impact of doing that? What are your job prospects? How are you going to feed your family? Very, very practical advice, but really important advice, because the whistleblowers who don't get that advice can sometimes find themselves in really dire situations a few months after blowing the whistle, unemployed, unable to feed their families, unable to get a job, which creates its own sense of trauma. I think the other thing to know with whistleblowers is there's not a single one who's come to me for any other reason than they honestly think something is happening that shouldn't be happening, and want to get that information out there. So I think they tend to need quite a bit of support. Public brings a whole nother angle. They don't just need because even for the anonymous whistleblowers, they often need a support network around them. Imagine anonymously blowing the whistle, and then because you're trying to stay anonymous, not being able to tell anyone. Really hard to do, right? And creates its own sense of isolation. Whistleblowers talk often about feeling isolated from those around them, from their communities, from their networks, by the uniqueness of the situation they find themselves in. For those who go public, it's before and after, right? The minute they go public, there's journalists trying to talk to them. There's regulators trying to talk to them. There are any number of people reaching out, wanting to talk to them. They often have no experience with the media. They often don't know how to handle that. And so they need that kind of post support. They need support figuring out what we call phase 2 looks like. What does your post whistleblowing life look like? How do you move beyond the whistleblowing and get back to having a life? Because whistleblowing can be all consuming for the whistleblower. So I think those are all things, but I think the thing to remember is we all benefit from whistleblowers who often go public with significant information of significant public interest, because those whistleblowers are often reporting significant public harms that aren't being addressed internally. And at the same time, at the core is just a human, right? Who often in the process gets dehumanized. And so just remembering first and foremost that they're human and treating them humanly, or treating them as a human, as someone who is worth listening to, is one of the best tips I can give anyone dealing with a whistleblower.